So yeah, as Paul mentioned, nice to see everybody metaphorically. I'm Tyler, I'm a product manager here. I focus on reporting and data aspects of the platform. And yeah, I'm here today to talk a little bit about a new product we're adding to our suite of log products that we really think will help complement that and streamline and make it easier for customers to get access to the log data and make the decisions they need to make with that data. So yeah, I'll jump into agenda as Paul mentioned. So I think not everybody on the call may be familiar with our logs offering, so I'm going to touch a little bit on that first. We'll talk a little bit about the pain points of ingesting logs today and how Antenna will help solve that for customers. We'll talk through some use cases, and then we'll bring in Jordan for a minute, who helped beta test the product, to sort of talk a little bit about how he used it. And then I'll close with some technical details on how it works and the roadmap, as well as some Q&A. So yeah, to start, Beeswax, like most demand DSP players in the space, we offer logs for our customers. This is something that we invest a lot of effort in. We want to be transparent about the data that we provide our customers. So like a lot of DSPs out there, we'll offer impression data to customers, conversion data to customers, a lot of the table stakes for the data sets that you get. But in addition to that, one of the unique things about our model, which people will probably know, the QPS model, where your bidder can kind of selectively listen to the traffic and auctions that are relevant to you. One of the things that enables is also the ability for us to provide auction logs to our customers. So this can be really useful for customers who want to go and build forecasting or something like that. In addition, we also have table stakes batch data delivery. That's how most platforms will deliver logs, but we also know that a lot of customers want to make more real-time decisions with the data that's reaching their system. So we do offer streaming options for logs as well. And so we can post events to either a Kinesis stream or an HTTP endpoint. But regardless of whether you're using us or another solution, there's some reality that there's some pain points that come along with sort of setting up your initial log ingestion and maintaining that. And so to elaborate on that, let me go to this slide. So there's a non-trivial upfront cost for any sort of time you're sort of choosing to ingest new log level data. So, depending on your organization, data engineering resources are potentially limited in nature, and they may not fall under your jurisdiction of where you sit in the organization. So maybe when you first sign up with Beeswax or another competitor, you have to go set up that integration, pull aside engineering resources, get those sort of pipelines set up. And all of that comes at the cost of potentially another engineering project that you could be working on instead. Additionally, once you sort of have that initial setup in place, there's all this work that comes along with sort of maintaining and upkeeping those data pipelines in place. So there's going to be new infrastructure that comes along with this. There's going to be code. Your team's going to have to constantly maintain and monitor those to make sure nothing breaks. Let's also say something like Beeswax adds new fields to logs, which we do pretty frequently when customers ask about it. Your team may have to go make a change to be able to process that data and pull it into your system. So all of this leads to, a lot of engineering time and maintenance of pipelines. And then finally, there's obviously, I'll just kind of jump into the next slide, but there's obviously like a cloud infrastructural cost to processing logs. So, the way that this is kind of your standard extract, transform, load ETL process, where you're taking data from a DSP, dumping it in an S3 bucket. Number of customers pretty standardly will take that data, transform it in some way. We typically recommend customers dedupe data, for example, and so that happens over here in this transform step. And then that all has to be loaded into a data warehouse just to make it accessible through a BI tool or SQL interface. And so this is a lot of infrastructural overhead for, not only the cost of it, but also, as previously mentioned, there's like engineering resources that come along with like maintaining this and making sure it all works. And so, so essentially, Antenna was this idea where how could we go about sort of solving this for our customers? And so late last year, we ended up partnering with a new data warehousing technology that now powers our whole reporting stack called Snowflake. And as a result of that, we're now able to leverage many of Snowflake's features to more easily share and distribute customer log data. And the way that works is effectively, if you already have an existing Snowflake account, we can share your log data directly from our Snowflake account to your Snowflake account for querying purposes. Or if you choose not to be in a commercial relationship with Snowflake, we can spin up a limited read-only access account that you can use to read your own log files within our organization. And so what that ends up looking like is this. And so we go from this whole process before, where there's additional infrastructure and overhead, to really something where we've already pre-set up the pipelines. We have to just run a few configuration commands, and the data can just show up for querying in your data warehouse natively. Importantly, I mean, obviously, if it's your own Snowflake instance, you can hook it up to any application, but even that reader instance, you can hook up to a visualization tool. Your analysts will have full SQL access via either a UI or command line tools or whatever they want. And you can hook it up to an application if you want to. There's all sorts of things you can do. It's basically that reader account, in addition to obviously your own Snowflake account, is a fully fledged data warehouse that you can kind of do what you need to do with logs for your organization. So I'll talk a little bit about use cases, and I'll pass it off to Jordan here at the end. But yeah, so here's a few sample things you can do with Antenna. So there's a lot of, obviously we have a query tool in our platform. It's very valuable for a number of customers, but there's just some analyses that you won't be able to do in query tool. You simply can't model every single SQL query you want to do. And so if you want to run some ad hoc queries to inform your programmatic strategy, for example, I'd recommend checking out our docs page. We wrote up a great tutorial on how you can use Antenna to do a reach and frequency analysis. That's something you could leverage Antenna to do as well. In addition to that, because it's your own Snowflake instance potentially, you can come and bring our log data and join it directly with your data directly. There's no additional steps required for that. Another great use case is modeling out different bidding strategies. Some people will be familiar with our bid models product. So you can hook up a tool like AWS SageMaker directly to your log data, use that to build a bid model. And there's none of that additional upfront overhead to sort of set up the data pipelines to get that data to SageMaker. And then finally, I kind of touched upon this before, but if you want to hook this up to a BI tool or an application, it's a fully fledged data warehouse, and you can sort of do what you need to do with logs there. And so those are just a few sort of applications. But yeah, we think there's a lot of countless things customers can do.
Yeah, and since there's countless things customers can do, oftentimes, it's difficult to envision what you might be able to do unless you hear from what somebody did. So we're very grateful to have with us today Jordan Bentley, who's the founder of ClearRTB. They drive performance for brands and advertisers every day and are really on the front lines of this, building stuff, basically. So Jordan, welcome.
Thank you.
And just a bit of a fun Zoom warning is that Jordan may be on some shaky Wi-Fi, so if he breaks up or something like that, you'll forgive him. And but let's just dive right into it. So you've been beta testing Antenna. What are your just first thoughts about it, and how have you been using it?
Yeah. So in terms of first thoughts, I can't state how simple it makes leveraging logs. Prior to Antenna, and it was interesting the timeline that Beeswax kind of developed this, because we actually came to Beeswax saying it would be great if you had something like this. Because prior to this, we were managing all the logging ourselves. And as Tyler stepped through that process, it may seem easy and, it's not really rocket science per se, but, with cloud stuff, if you're not constantly watching it, it just seems to break. Right. And so it was always something that we either had to keep an eye on, or we were spending resources just so that we could query the data in the way that we wanted to. And so, yeah, using Antenna just took all that pain, just kind of makes it logs as a service, if you will, so that we can focus on improving campaign performance and adding value to our clients.
Yeah. So let's talk about a couple of use cases that you use log files for, instead of just a set it and forget it black box type of algorithm.
Yeah, so for sure. So for us, programmatic is about buying the best impressions for our clients based on their budget, targeting, and campaign constraints. The reality is you really don't know if you're buying the best impressions unless you can look at the impressions that you bid on and didn't win, as well as the impressions you didn't even bid on, right? So if you think about, most DSPs have some pacing algorithm that's really just sampling the QPS or sampling the bids. And so you might, buy your 10,000 impressions for that day, but you don't know what you missed. And so Antenna allows us to do this sort of retrospective after the fact and say, okay, here's what we bought today. Let's look at the impressions we either bid on and didn't win, or the stuff we didn't even bid on because we spent our budget too fast or whatever, and look back at that and say, okay, yeah, there were some better requests. What tunes and tweaks do we need to make in our model such that we're getting, impressions X, Y, and Z, and helping improve the campaign performance even better?
Yeah. So it's almost like, if I could paraphrase, it's like you have this like listening thing, this antenna up there in the cloud of all the auctions that are happening, and you're able to gain access to all those and make better decisions for your marketing.
Exactly. Well said.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you for giving us that. Do you have any other thoughts to share? Anything you think that people should know if they're considering beeswax or they're considering using Antenna?
Yeah, we've been a customer of Beeswax for a long time, and really just like this approach of being able to bid the way we want to. So with Beeswax, we're able to build our own bidder. So instead of just buying impressions that, match the minimum targeting requirements in terms of frequency caps or geos or stuff like that, we're able to build models off in view duration, ad density on pages. And so our buying can be a lot more sophisticated than you get with the other DSPs who simply just want to maximize your spend, right? That's how they make money. With Beeswax, there's no ulterior motive here in terms of how good, my buying is or different strategies I can use. It's really like, hey, here's the tools. And so we view Beeswax as well as this great Antenna product, really just kind of as infrastructure as a service. They do the heavy lifting behind the scenes, right? Nobody runs their own servers anymore. They use AWS, they use Google. We view this the same way. There's no reason for us to set up all this process of ETL pipelines and jobs to manage logs when we can use a great product like Antenna that's done at a very reasonable cost that enables us to do more with the valuable engineering resources that we do have.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Jordan. And if you wouldn't mind sticking around until the end, we'll have a Q&A part, and folks who have questions about Jordan's experience or his business, feel free to put a question in the Q&A, and we'll bring it back then. So stick around. And in the meantime, and thank you so much for joining, of course. And in the meantime, Tyler, I'll pass it back to you to tell us a little bit about how this all works.
Yeah, so I suspect some people may have some questions about, what this kind of looks like under the hood. So I'll do my best to, summarize it at a high level, but feel free to ask more in the Q&A as well. But so the gist is, I'll touch upon how it works for Snowflake customers and also how the reader account works. So here on the left side, our reporting platform is all hosted on Snowflake today. And what we've done is, in contrast to traditional logs, we load the customer logs into our Snowflake platform today. And then using some Snowflake features and some features we built, we're able to share that data for access to a customer Snowflake instance. And what that actually means is the data is still stored in our system, but when the customer Snowflake instance requests access to this data, and the way that works is it just shows up as a table in your system. But when you query that table, it actually runs a request to our system. We return back the data you need, and then the query just runs as it normal in your warehouse. It doesn't functionally look any different than running a query in your data warehouse today or within your own Snowflake. But the important thing is really that it's all just stored in our database, and you're effectively querying our database. And so there's two important things to note about that. One is that means that we're storing the data, which I already kind of stressed before, but that means you don't have to worry about the costs of that data. So if you would just like us to store all your logs for you and just query it ad hoc as necessary, you can do that. Of course, if you'd like to copy it out, there are ways to do that. So you basically just query for the data, but then you create a new table and dump the data from a table into your own Snowflake instance. So both approaches are equally valid, but if you don't want to worry about storage, that's totally something you can do. The second thing I wanted to stress is because it is your own Snowflake instance and you may have your own proprietary data in there, I've already kind of touched upon this, but you can natively join our data with your data. It doesn't functionally behave any different than a table in your database today. It's effectively the same thing as if the data were stored natively in your Snowflake instance. So we also understand that a number of customers are probably not ready to enter a commercial agreement with Snowflake, and that's fine because we've worked with Snowflake to basically provide this capability of what we call reader accounts, which are effectively Snowflake instances that we host on your behalf as a customer. There are some limitations with this account. It's effectively a read-only account, so you can't come in and load, unlimited amounts of data. But if you just want to use it to sort of query your logs and let us sort of handle all the infrastructure and the commercial relationship with Snowflake, and let us intermediate that, that is something we can do. But it operates much the same way where we still load your logs into our main database, but you will get your own Snowflake instance that can query against that main database. I'm kind of beating the dead horse here, but again, this is like a fully, with the exception of some of the loading capabilities that I previously mentioned, this is still a fully fledged Snowflake instance that if you want to hook up to, Looker or Tableau or some other tool, that's all things you can still do. So yeah, this is all, I think, some summary of what we've kind of previously discussed. So it's a fully fledged data warehouse. You can join within your own Snowflake instance. We're managing the storage of this data on your behalf. And all the queries still happen within your own Snowflake account. And so I didn't really touch upon that, but that also means if you have your own Snowflake account, any sort of queries you're running against the data, Beeswax has nothing to do with how we charge you for that. That's all dictated by you and Snowflake. So if you have a discounted agreement with Snowflake to sort of for your compute costs, that's all dictated by that. And the only game we play is sharing the data with you and making that accessible to you. And then one final detail that I feel is kind of important to highlight is for the initial release, we're only able to support this in Amazon's US East 1. That's just because of the nature of Snowflake's limitations right now. The Snowflake accounts have to be in the same region, but they're adding cross-region support, and we're looking to add that in the future. One sort of important clarifying point about that is that doesn't mean that you're not going to receive data from bidders in other regions. So if you have a bidder in EU West, for example, that data is still reaching US East 1. We just consolidate all of the bidder data into a single reporting database on our end, which happens to be in US East 1. So all your data is still accessible. It just so happens that reporting is in US East 1. And so finally, I'll kind of close with some brief thoughts on the roadmap here. Nothing too concrete, transparently, but what I do want to stress is that, Antenna is something we view as a platform here, and we're really excited about this. Log level data was really just table stakes for us, and we're sort of actively exploring both additional data we can bring in from Beeswax, whether that's data from Buzz or other sort of stuff that we store on your behalf and making that accessible to you, as well as working with third-party partners to make that data more easily accessible to you and give you new insights that weren't previously capable. And then also, we also want to tightly integrate this into the Buzz application today. This is something we're exploring, but where we're really interested in, potentially like what it would mean if you could run a query in Antenna and take those data results and do something with it in Buzz to help traffic a campaign or build a targeting list or something like that. So these are all things we're really excited about. And while none of that's, concretely slated, it's all stuff that we're sort of investigating. So yeah, that's all I have. I want to thank people for joining. I want to thank Jordan for joining as well. If folks have more, I'll I'm happy to do Q&A in a second, but if folks have more questions, there's also great stuff on docs.beeswax.com. Yeah.
Yeah, great. That was awesome, Tyler. Thank you. We do have quite a few questions, and I'll remind folks if you want to submit them via the Q&A feature on the bottom. That's the best way for us to see them. Definitely so biggest question that we're getting a lot is like about pricing and additional costs. You just want to say a couple, I mean, really, you should contact your Beeswax account representative or your sales rep, but what's just the basic structure, you know, just so folks can understand how in general it's being priced?
Sure. So the way it works is, in addition to existing log fees, we will charge a small fee on top of that for the antenna service. And the reason for that is I kind of touched upon this earlier, but it's all net new infrastructure because we're taking the same log infrastructure that we historically had and dumping to S3, but instead we're dumping that into our own S3 and then doing some additional processing and loading it into antenna. So there's some additional infrastructure on the tail end of the pipeline that we have to effectively charge for.
Yeah.
But yeah,
So,
it's an additional fee on top of logs.
But contact your account rep or sales rep, and we'll make sure that it's cost effective for you. So this is a question I believe directed at Jordan, who's joined us again for the Q&A. Thanks and welcome back. What cost savings have you seen by using Snowflake? Do you see additional cost savings for customers that also use Snowflake as opposed to accessing a reader account? I guess that's the second part of the question, might be for Tyler.
Sure, and I can actually touch a little bit on that as well because we've set it up both ways. In terms of cost savings, there are the obvious costs associated with, you know, ETL workflows, right? So, you know, previously we were getting the data, putting it in S3, so storing it in S3, right? Then we were reading in that data and then having to, you know, put it in a data warehouse somewhere, whether that was Redshift or there's various other products there, right? So you've got storage costs, compute costs to process all of that, and then of course, warehousing costs. One of the reasons we actually reached out to Beeswax about this was because managing and running your own logs becomes pretty expensive. You know, it adds up a lot, especially because a lot of these queries that we would run would be various ad hoc queries. So it wasn't like we had the same query every day that we knew we were going to go run 100 times. And so you end up spending a lot of time and resources just for the capability of like, well, I would actually like to go ask this question. And oh, the data shows that. Well, what about this? So in terms of direct cost savings for us, it saved us a lot of money because we no longer host the data in S3. We still have access to it because we have, which I'll talk to in a second, we have a Snowflake account, and so we can read the data into our system. But we don't have to host the data. We don't have to do all the compute to read it in. We just can query it. So there's significant cost savings for us, you know, and now we're able to leverage logs like auction logs, for example, that are just huge in nature that we played with at various times in the past because they're so expensive to process. Now we can take full advantage of that, again, without any of those costs. And then speaking to kind of the reader versus your own Snowflake account, the reader works really well. Again, we started the beta test just using the reader and really liked that. We ended up getting our own Snowflake account as well. The main motivation for that was now we can join a bunch of our own in-house first-party data and combine a lot of this log data with our own first-party data to, again, better identify performance improvements.
Great. Thank you, Jordan. We have another question. It's a more general question for Tyler. So antenna specifically focuses on auction logs, not so much win logs or segment logs. In what ways can this info be used? Is it not true, Tyler, that, I mean, really, this is just all of the logs. I mean, you know, the table stakes are the win logs. That's what. So can you just talk a little bit to underline that?
Yeah, I suppose I wasn't clear. Yeah, Antenna offers all the same logs that you can get via S3 delivery today. So that's win logs, conversion logs, bid logs, auction logs, attributed conversion logs, loss logs. Maybe I missed one, but so segment logs as well. So all the logs are still available via Antenna today. And so it really just depends on what you want to get out of it. I'm sorry, there was maybe a second half to the question that I'm.
No, you
Great.
you covered it. Another question, what kind of lag will we see? It sounds like it's built on top of the pre-existing logging feature. So is that the same real-time data available when accessing through Snowflake?
Yeah, this is a great question. So the data is, there's more firm details on the docs.beeswax page, but I'll briefly touch upon it. So we load the data into Antenna hourly, but there are different delays depending on the data set. So for example, attributed conversions, we always wait a little bit after the conversion before we actually process it for attribution. So that's, I think, 4 or 5 hours behind, for example. But most of the delays are 1 hour behind. I think the notable thing that might be compelling to a lot of people is win logs today. There's a big sort of fundamental difference in Antenna versus the traditional logs. The traditional logs, we have to wait for several hours because we might want to include a late arriving click or a late arriving video complete, or even a conversion in some case, before we emit the file to you. So we wait a little bit before we actually emit those, even if it's on an hourly cadence, because it's hourly, but it's like 4 hours behind. With Antenna, it's different because we still have access to the data and we can continue to update it. So that data is available every hour, but it is the most recent hour's data, because even if a click comes in 12 hours late, very extreme example, because we still have control over the data, we can bring that click in and update the row accordingly. Whereas if we were emitting the file to you, we wouldn't be able to do that. So as a result, we can actually provide win data a little bit more quickly.
Wonderful. Another question, how is Antenna helpful for a company with AWS cloud infrastructure set up already?
So it's a good question. What I'll say is it's useful if you're looking to sort of, as we sort of discussed, if you're looking to cut costs on your existing data pipelines. You can provision Snowflake through AWS. In fact, you have to pick a cloud provider to provision it through. So it does work very natively with other AWS technologies. It kind of depends on what the subtext of your question is. If you're looking to save costs, it can obviously save costs with AWS, but it also very natively interacts with other AWS tools. I kind of briefly touched upon this, but SageMaker, for example, which is what we use internally to build bid models, you can just hook into Snowflake directly, for example. So it kind of depends on your use case, but it does play very well natively with AWS.
Great.
Tyler, do you care if I jump in there, Paul, really quick?
Please.
So we use AWS really heavily. Again, everybody's use case is slightly different. We really like the Snowflake product in and of itself. We used a lot of different warehouse products that AWS has, whether it's EMR, Redshift, you can kind of go Athena, you can kind of go down the list. And due to the volume of data that is produced with logs, it becomes really expensive in AWS because in general, AWS typically has storage and compute coupled, or if they don't, it's kind of two extremes. You either have the Ferrari or you have the Honda Civic. And you either pay a fortune or your costs are low, but then it's really slow. Snowflake, it just has a great product that it decouples your storage costs with your compute costs. And so it's really quick and responsive with a lot of those cost savings. And so that was a challenge we were struggling with before, was, just the warehousing cost of all this stuff in AWS gets really pricey over time. And Snowflake has really helped us out with that.
Thank you, Jordan. Going on to the next question, I'll read this one slowly to make sure I get it right. Can you selectively pick the logs to work with in Antenna? For example, the QPS requests due to their size. These are easily scripted for management as long as you monitor the schema for updates. However, the main issue is storage costs with the requests. How would the storage costs compare, and how long is the data available?
So that might be a good question to follow up directly with, because I'm not sure I fully grasp the question. But what I will say about selective so to start, you don't have to opt into every single log type. So if you only care about win logs, for example, you can only subscribe to win logs. That's totally an option, and you will be priced accordingly for that. The other thing is, if you're really worried about the storage cost, if I'm understanding your question correctly, because we're on the hook for the storage, if you want to pull in only selective columns into your own data warehouse after the fact, you can just kind of build a derivative table with just the fields that are important to you. And so when you sort of select the columns out of the field and build a new table, if you only wanted 3 of the 150 columns that are in most of the logs, you can select that. I'm not sure I fully grasped the question, but please, my email is here. So please feel free to like reach out to me directly, and we can talk it out and make sure that I get you the right answer.
Wonderful. And just to remind folks, we are not naming any the people who are asking the questions, but we do have a report that we get. So if there's a question that we weren't able to get to, or one that Tyler doesn't immediately have the answer to, we will reach out and make sure that you get that situation sorted and get the answer that you need to be able to make a decision. Moving on to the next question. Now this came in early during the webinar, so it was probably addressed to some extent, but there's a few like this, which is, how does Antenna specifically benefit non-Snowflake clients? Like, I would imagine people who don't currently have a Snowflake account, and like you said, aren't really interested or ready to get into a commercial arrangement with Snowflake.
So Jordan may also be able to answer that. I don't want to sign him up for the question, but I think it's useful for customers who especially are a little bit resource strapped in their organization. Because even if you want to go set up a Snowflake instance, there's some stand up that your engineering team has to do to go get that done. So if you would prefer to just let us handle it, there's a lot of benefits to just us giving you a login and having it work. And if you want to just have us, if you just want to log in and be able to run ad hoc queries on whatever basis without having to do all the setup, that's a great use case for a reader account. It really, I think, like my perception of the value prop there is that it really allows you to expedite the time to value, right? Because all you need to do is talk to us, enter the agreement, and then get the login, and then you can kind of start to do your analysis, versus the longer term, like doing a customer integration, like getting your own Snowflake. Obviously, you just have to go through that setup with Snowflake, and so there's a little bit more time to stand up and get the data that you need in to do that joining. So I think it's just a little bit about time to value and whether you want to actually do something with Snowflake.
And probably risk too. I mean, you can evaluate the value of this product before you have to get into some big arrangement that requires you to do a bunch of work.
Yeah, I mean, Jordan's, I think, a great use case for that, because he started out trying the reader version, and I think he really liked it and sees like applications to bring in his own data. And so I think, yeah, it's a great trial as well for, seeing if Snowflake is even right for you. So.
Yeah. And then I think Jordan touched on this, but there is a limitation, right? There's a question here. If our organization doesn't use Snowflake and we decide to use the read-only Snowflake instance, can we join Beeswax logs with our own internal data using this instance?
You want me to answer that, or Jordan?
Yeah.
Yeah. So right now that's not possible. You would have to somehow transfer the logs from Snowflake to Redshift or BigQuery, whatever sort of technology you're using. I don't know off the top of the head what sort of connections are available for that sort of thing, but theoretically you could do it. I don't know if it nets out to less work, because it's a little bit of an interesting design pattern with regards to ingesting data, but it doesn't work natively, is I guess what I would say. Okay.
Well, the other comment on that, just jumping in, is you can do the joins on your side. Again, it's not quite as slick, but you could, if you were wanting IP addresses for some line item that you're running for everything that you bid on, you can still run that query in the reader account, either via the UI or programmatically via like an SDK, get that data, and then go join that with your in-house data. So again, depending on how big the data set is that you're joining, you can manage that just by joining the data on your side.
Right, that's a good point. If you want to just use it as a mechanism to get the data out, you can certainly export a file and which is something you can do with even a reader account, and then load that into another databasing technology.
Excellent. And thanks for the clarification on that, Jordan. It's always great to hear it from somebody who's actually using it. I mean, we can talk all day long about our products and how they work, but the actual rubber hits the road, you know, manipulating the data and doing stuff that drives performance and efficiency is really valuable. Moving on to the next question for Tyler, is there a limit, QPS, question mark, on the interaction with the data through antenna?
So what I'll say is your QPS is all, so with the exception of auction logs, which I'll talk about in a second, all of your QPS is logged. It's the same as the S3 files. You get 100% of all those events for everything except auction logs. With auction logs, we can set a configurable sampling percentage. And so by default, I think we're recommending people go with 1%. And that's a trade-off because A, we have to store more of that data, but B, also when you go and run the queries, processing 100% of auctions is going to be a very, very large amount of data. And so it kind of depends on your accuracy versus cost sort of trade-off you want to make. So we find we're recommending customers do 1%. We can log more auctions or higher QPS for you within antenna, but that's that may affect pricing accordingly. But to kind of directly answer the QPS thing, we don't selectively only log certain QPS with the exception of that sampling percentage for auction logs.
Great. Here's a question that I think, Jordan, maybe you want to take. Any specific reasons for choosing Snowflake over AWS Athena for query interface?
So the query interface is almost the exact same as Athena, right? Athena is effectively SQL, and Snowflake has, again, the same interaction. Again, I'm not an expert on the Snowflake magic behind the scenes of how they do it, but the queries run way faster in Snowflake and the costs are way lower. We used Athena for a while and had the unfortunate pleasure of paying for those query bills, and they add up. But yeah, the interface and the way it works is very, very similar. Snowflake just tends to do a better job with it, to be honest.
All right.
Yeah. I'd also like to just jump in there and echo what Jordan's saying, which is historically experience with Athena is that it's you obviously get to cut out the process of like loading the data into a database, but because it's querying the log files directly, it can be a very, very expensive solution.
Right on. We have a few more questions. I'll try to get through them all. Can we configure real-time alerts on data available in antenna?
So I already kind of touched upon the delays in the data. So that we only load data into antenna hourly. So it wouldn't be real time in that fashion. However, if you want to connect, like for example, a command line, you could. There's all sorts of connectors to Snowflake. The one I'm most familiar with is the command line interface. But if you want to run a query that polls and runs a query and generates an alert if there's some threshold value, that's something you can certainly do. The only thing I think with consideration to your question that might be a problem is the delay in the loading of the data.
All right. And how long is the log data retained for? Is that flexible? And if so, does the cost change based on the retainment length?
Great question. This is also available on docs.beeswax.com. Right now, the retention window is not flexible for logs. But if that's something that's really important to people in the future, it's something we can certainly consider in terms of product development. But right now, the windows differ by log type. So I think like off the top of my head, I think like impressions is like 12 months and change. And then the larger data sets are a lot smaller. So like auctions, for example, we only store for 30 days simply because it's just such high volume for us to store. One thing to note there is it's something, again, I've kind of touched upon in the past, but if you would like to copy that data out into your own data warehouse and retain it for longer, that's certainly something you can do if you're using your own customer Snowflake account.
Okay, wonderful. Question about the future of Snowflake. Do we foresee supporting other or future of antenna. Sorry, do we foresee support of any other platforms, warehouse vendors other than Snowflake?
Not right. No, that doesn't seem to be on the horizon. But it's something I think we're always interested in, like learning about new technologies. We're very happy with Snowflake support. As far as I know, competitors such as like BigQuery and Redshift don't really offer a similar service to this. But if they did, and we learned a little bit more about it, it's certainly something we could look into.
All right, and we have one last question. Is there an ETA for cross-region support in AWS?
No ETA right now. Totally acknowledge it's very important to customers. We were trying to get it out to US East for the initial launch, and also I think I mentioned Snowflake support for the cross-region stuff is currently in what they call preview, which I think is a bit open beta. And so we're also wanting to develop a little bit around making sure that support is widely available and has like an SLA behind it. So no ETA at this point, but it's something we know is certainly important to customers.
All right, well, thank you so much, Tyler. Thank you so much, Jordan, especially for all the kind words and helping these folks who've tuned in understand the real life usage of this product and how it really impacts your daily life. And thank all of you for joining and spending time with us today to learn about a new product. We'll be back at you with lots of other webinars like this and our quick 15 minutes with Beeswax sessions all the time on various different parts of the product and things you can do with it. But until then, I hope all of you are staying safe and healthy, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much.